auxiliary constructions, I have a couple of examples just to start off. So what I'm thinking of, and I'm going to discuss a little bit about auxiliaries and then auxiliary constructions. I'm essentially considering them to be constructions consisting of two or more verb forms, or elements of verbal origin, in which one is playing a grammatical function of some kind. So we'll look at some of the grammatical functions that are played by these, and then some of the variations. So I just have examples there from Swahili and Hehe to give you a sort of idea of the types of things that we're looking at, but they will be familiar, and yeah, we've already actually sort of seen them over the last few days, I'm sure, as well. I'm very much providing a kind of synchronic overview of variation and hoping that that will provide us with insights into possible sort of historical and insights into what we might do for reconstruction, but I'm sort of tentative in that regard, and I'll leave that to people who work really, that's their sort of bread and butter. But the kind of things that we're keeping in mind are what type of auxiliary constructions are attested in Bantu languages sort of in present day. What's the nature of the variation, so what are the sort of different areas in which we find variation? What type of construction might we want to reconstruct? And do we want to think of reconstruction as an auxiliary construction or like individual things? So is there a particular auxiliary or verb type thing that we want to construct? Is the spotlight now going to come down as well?
The lights were helping.
Yeah. Can you switch the lights back?
We're making it go in the dark a bit.
Shall I stand over there? I'll just give what was the...
Someone asked to be deprived of the sun in her eyes. So that's why I
Oh, you're sitting next to a queen.
I did. No, the queen is sitting over there.
I would always go.
Okay.
Okay.
No,
Let's
it's
go
nothing
back.
to do. Okay. And also sort of, and actually this links very nicely to what Mark was talking about before, so auxiliaries, as we see, sort of, are they part of rapidly or more rapidly changing processes of change than others? So actually, at what point would we want to sort of freeze and say, okay, this was an auxiliary? If they're very much changing, then do those present specific challenges? So just on to sort of section 2, kind of functions. So very commonly we're used to sort of things like to do with tense, aspect, mood, and also negation. And so here to give you an idea of the variation that we're talking about. So the examples on the 2.1 sort of tense type discussions, and yeah, we were talking about what tense is and what aspect is. I'm not going into there, I'm just sort of using a broad brush definition here. So there may be auxiliaries that sort of themselves encode specific temporal information, but again, here at least I'm going on the basis of translations or the glosses that are provided, and a range of different tenses. The idea being then that, for example, in read, then will soon arrives at some kind of future, it simply comes from the auxiliary itself. So it's not like an auxiliary and a future marker. It seems that the auxiliary, or at least the auxiliary construction as a whole, gives you that future meaning. So that's the kind of thing that you see in examples in 3 and 4, and that contrasts to the examples on the top of page 2, so in 5, 6 and 7, where the auxiliary has little or no kind of semantic, but particularly here, temporal contribution, but then has a specific tense aspect or tense marker on it. So you have an auxiliary with a prefix which encodes some particular tense. So the examples there, like the Swahili future tense, or the Korea one, remote past, but maybe someone will comment on that. But yeah, so you have already this variation between whether the auxiliary contributes some kind of temporal distinction, or whether the auxiliary just hosts another prefix. Other sort of general semantic restrictions still sort of apply, so you wouldn't be allowed to combine certain sort of information. So it might be that the auxiliary has to host aspect and the main verb hosts tense and things like that. At the end of some of the sections I have this little bullet point where it says of a sample of 37 languages, and this comes from a project that Rosen and Lutz Martin, who was here yesterday, and myself have been working on. So we have a database of morphosyntactic variation, and some of the parameters in that pertain to some of these things. So what I've just done is pulled out the information there. So we have there in a sample of 37 languages, and then it happens that something that says like 7 can be used in all tense aspect combinations, but for example 13 have specific auxiliaries for specific distinctions. So yeah, I'm not making any kind of massive quantitative sort of conclusions there, but just to see if there is variation, if we have an idea. This, at least in our sample, is more prominent strategy than in another one, for example. So it's a very similar sort of picture with aspect. So you may have an auxiliary which itself sort of seems to encode an aspectual function. An example there from vendor, which is sort of glossed there as a kind of continuous thing. So they always or continuously read. And these kind of auxiliaries actually we'll look at again later on, because there's also sort of discussion of where you say, well, this is an auxiliary, this is a verb, and sometimes when they're still the same form, again, to sort of be a bit more precise and say how we decide between that. So they can encode specific aspectual functions. So you have, something like continuous or sort of repetition. Or again, like with tense, it's a combination of elements which encodes, for example, in the Herrera example, perfect or something like that. So flipping over the page, top of page 3, again, that's this sort of idea that you have semantic restrictions. So in Songa, you have an auxiliary which here is glossed and then also described as encoding something like once, but then you can't use it with the future tense marker. So there would be sort of restrictions in terms of the sort of semantics and then what you could combine with what. If you're thinking it was sort of purely grammaticalized, you might think that once you should be able to, in theory, say they will once steal the car. They will steal the car. They will steal the car once. No, it's no good. If I've looked at it too much.
Once meaning one time?
Yeah.
Or one time in the past? I mean,
but in the future. Oh. So it's not that they're going to be stealing cars every week. They will steal the car. I'll just do it once. Maybe not. Yeah. So anyway, you also can't do that in this example. So in Songa, so that sort of fits with that. You have modal distinctions as well, which can be encoded through auxiliaries. And here I don't have a sort of a range of different languages, but we have this sort of table that was from joint work with Lewis Martin from Siswati, but the data again are taken from another source. But you have these auxiliary forms which convey much more sort of modal meanings, often relating to kind of ability or intention. So sort of should, might, intend to, be inclined to. I mean, again, these are sort of translations, and then you can see them very, in most cases, transparently related to main verbs and their lexical origins, sometimes with no change at all. Not all of them can kind of be traced back, but sometimes with a few changes along the way. Our next sort of category would then be more kind of adverbial meanings, or what I'm calling here sort of adverbial-like things. Again, another example from Tonga. So something like eventually. So here you have, and here this is just the sort of following their orthographic convention, but still it seems that it's playing this role of an auxiliary in that you have subject marker, tense marker, and then this thing, and then another subject marker and verb. So again, in terms of my definition, I'm sort of saying, well, you have one thing that's playing a much more grammatical function in the first place. I suppose my definition of it coming from of being of lexical origin, I'm not sure specifically what that verb was or is, but the construction looks very similar to what we saw from the Swahili example earlier on. For example, you have subject marker tense element, and then the same thing with a verb following that. The next example for Rabungo, something like already, and again, here, again, the gloss is just sort of orcs. So I'm following other people's ideas or definitions in terms of that, just to try and get a selection. And then from Eton, so some of Mark's work, auxiliary forms, and then some of them with their lexical origins, just in terms of sort of seeing other types of meanings as well. So maybe the kind of tense and aspect we're more used to, but seeing actually a much broader range of things that can be different distinctions that can be encoded. So then again at the bottom of that one we have data from 40 languages in our sample. And the question here is something like, in addition to distinctions such as tense and aspect, what are other auxiliaries that can encode other things? And actually, you have there sort of 9 auxiliaries only express those kind of distinctions that might be more familiar. 12 also encode modality type reading, so kind of ability, possibility, permission. 3 with sort of what we call here more aspectual, or what people have reported as more aspectual, and then 14 of this modality. So again, that's not sort of necessarily captures the full variation, even within those languages, because that's on the basis of what people say, oh yes, there is this auxiliary which encodes this function, but again, it's not like you have 0 languages doing this and all doing that. So building up sort of general picture of variation across the board. So the final sort of function, the final bit under the function section, the kind of grammatical functions is negation. And again, we see actually the same distinction. So it can be a dedicated negative auxiliary. This seems to be a bit less widespread. But the example there, which is sort of translated, we will not escape in here, glossed as aux neg, so a negative auxiliary form in itself. But otherwise, you can have what I've called here otherwise affirmative auxiliary, just an auxiliary which doesn't itself encode a negative meaning, marked for negative polarity. So that's what we have an example from Setswana and Lukusu, with a negative marker, and as far as I know, that then just appearing as a prefix on the auxiliary, or the auxiliary part of the construction, or then on the main verb. So actually those examples from Setswana saying that you can do both options are available in the language, so not necessarily that one language always does this or the other. And there's some data from Swahili which have been described as showing that actually whether the negation is marked on the auxiliary or on the main verb also has differences in sort of attendant scope readings. So the examples over the page now, at the top of page 5, the examples under 19. So 19a, we used to buy potatoes, so not negated at all. But in 19b, with the negative marker on the auxiliary form, the description there is something like the content as a whole is negated, meaning something like they never bought potatoes, they didn't buy potatoes at all, there was no potato buying event that occurred, so that's what's negated. Versus in 19c, when you have the negative marker on the verb, it's the buying that is negated, so they didn't buy potatoes. And perhaps if it's some kind of contrast, but they sold them or something else. So again, sort of differences in terms of where negation is marked, in terms of then what the sort of semantics of that is and what that would be used for. And yes, a sort of similar example from Kinyarwanda, but also then showing that something else then changes. So in Swahili, you can just have the marker either on the auxiliary on the main verb, so this is example 20. But if you have it in Kinyarwanda 20b, you have the negative marker after the subject agreement there, and that's then our sort of also, I think it's described as dependent form or subordinate negative form, so it appears differently than in a negative prefix before the subject marker. So we have a sort of picture of tense aspects, modality type things, adverbial type things, and certainly negation. And then, in fact, I've already sort of in a way started talking about this with negation, but then different subject marking kind of patterns, so again, variation in that. Subject marking on each of the forms, so subject marking on both the auxiliary and the main verb. So that's the examples we've already seen some of from earlier on in Swahili, but also in the examples in 21 to 23, so the bottom of page 5, subject marker, auxiliary, subject marker, auxiliary. Obviously the same one in each case. And this also seems to be linked to certain types of constructions. So we'll look more at the sources of these auxiliaries and the constructions, but it's sort of been said that in structures in which the first element was something like a copular type form, still inflected, but inflected copular form, something much more linked just to be, then you often have subject marking on both forms. So that kind of seems to pattern together, and then a sort of observation in terms of the distribution of those types of constructions. So these are typically for aspectual categories, perfect and completed. We have the sort of Hannah's work at the bottom there. So then that's subject marking on both forms. Well, yeah, that kind of subject marking on both forms. And the other option is auxiliary then with infinitive. So you have more like a kind of infinitive marker, the coup, which is what you have in 26 and 27. So still subject mark on the auxiliary, the main verb appearing in sort of infinitive form, or a bare form. So that's what you have in 28. So no coup, just the form itself. And again, this can vary within a language, so the examples there, so it says in Zulu, you have different auxiliaries which do different things. So it's not that language X always does this, but there are certain auxiliary forms, and Zulu has quite a large inventory of auxiliary forms, so some always appear with infinitives, some appear with verbs that are used in the subjunctive, again indicating kind of historical origins, one would imagine. So Swahili would sort of come under that first category if you sort of say, okay, you have subject marking on the auxiliary and on the main verb, but there is a bare verb form that you find with what I've sort of said here is an auxiliary or auxiliarizing form, which is taka, so derived from, but also the same as the verb just for want. So you can say something like Nina taka cheza, suggesting that taka is becoming or has become an auxiliary for certain speakers without the coup there. You can also have a subject marker in addition to the infinitive, so like in the example in 30, first person plural subject marker, and then the coup as well. So over the page, 31 and 32, examples of the same kind of thing. So again, subject marker and infinitive. Bottom of there, I've obviously left you to do some maths yourself. So I've said in a survey of X number of languages, so you have to add up whatever those are. But yeah, in the survey of that sample of languages, then just showing you the distribution of whether you have subject agreement on one form or on both forms. And then crucially, so 10 of those languages, it varies according to tense, which might be what we would expect. So again, it's not always subject marker, but certain tenses you find form then take an infinitival complement. So subject agreement, as expected, and then object agreement. Again, we really have sort of two possible patterns. So either on the auxiliary or on the main verb. And there in the example from Lamba, you have it marked on the main verb, so your auxiliary form, and then your object marker. And then in some languages that's not permitted. So you have there, it says in Northern Sotho, you can have the lexical verb can be object marked in just a sort of standard simplex construction if you want, but not in this kind of auxiliary type construction, at least on the basis of these examples. So again, different restrictions, perhaps indicative of different processes of historical change and underlying kind of structural differences as well. So just on to sort of origins of these types of things. So what I've sort of said here, and this is kind of supposed to be descriptive or an observation really. So you have kind of copular forms, something just still expressing the meaning of be, and then very broadly grammaticalized main verbs, lexical verbs. So just under 4.1, the role of copulars. The reason that I have this is that the examples in 36, just as by way of contrast. So 36a, this I would sort of take as a standard auxiliary construction in Rangi. So you have the ri, and then you have your main verb afterwards. I have set my trap, but it's exactly the same element that you would use in sort of a standard sort of base of predication. So I am a teacher uses exactly the same thing. So that's why I sort of think of that as a copular. It's inflecting, but yeah, that's sort of the idea behind that, rather than you might be thinking of sort of invariable copulars and saying, well, that's a different issue from auxiliary constructions. Some languages, exactly the same element is used. And you can see there in the Rangi example in 36a, again, you have this auxiliary which seems to host this past tense information, so kind of maybe is there for that purpose, allowing maybe an expression of a broader range of tense aspect distinctions or combinations than would be otherwise possible. So sort of similar, just building on that idea of sort of the role of what we might think of more broadly as copulars. In Samia, you have this form li, which seems to be used in the remote tense, but then it's observed that in other constructions, is a different form, a different auxiliary. So this ba, be, or sort of become type form, and a similar thing now in terms of the bear example in Siswati. So now we can sort of start thinking about, well, what actual forms might you want to see, what do you see reoccurring, or might you want to reconstruct. So that would be sort of what I'm then calling copulars because of this sort of predicative role they play in other contexts. But then I think the most widespread source would be lexical verbs, name verbs, very common source for auxiliary forms. Just sort of looking at some of then the distribution that occurs with that. So you have the examples at the bottom of page 8 now. So some from Sakuma where the form appears with in the subjunctive form. So that's sort of a pattern that you see. So the suggestion is that depending on what route of change it sort of went along to get to where it is now, you might see that playing out differently. So it might be indicated by what we had with Kinyaranda as a subordinate form, or you might have like the sort of subjunctive type constructions that we have in Sukuma and Northern Sutu, and also in Shambhala as well. So over the page to page 9. I think I will move to example 43. So the ones before that sort of showing similar things. So the next sort of thing is that you might have, again, what we saw also synchronically, verb with an infinitival complement. So that may be marked with ku, or it may not be. So the example there in 43 from Zulu at least has this kind of subject marker aux verb. Right, without this, what I was earlier on saying, you have subject marker, auxiliary subject marker, and that's how you know it's auxiliary. Now we've lost the subject marker, in fact we've lost the infinitival marker as well. And in contrast to 44, so you still have ku, and here you might just say, well, this is either how they've analysed it or written it. You may still want to have that as two separate words in scare quotes. So that would then just be our standard auxiliary form with a ku type complement. Again, some kind of links, and I haven't got much of a broad picture here, but you have a link between, for example, very standard cross-linguistic paths of change, so volitional verbs being related to things like potentiality, future tense, and things like that, so very kind of typologically common examples, which is what we have in the example from Trabo there. Auxiliary from the verb to want being linked with a future reading. So this is hopefully sort of things that are familiar, although maybe sort of like looking at what the areas of variation are. Then some of the things that I think are perhaps less common, but this links into some of the discussion from yesterday. So to what extent do you want to say that frequency is then important if something's less common? How does that play out? So usually, common restriction is you can't have anything intervening between the auxiliary and the main verb. And we have an example from Eton there where it seems that you can have something like what's here translated as really, so an adverb between the auxiliary and the main verb, and actually here a pronoun as well, I think. So again, you can sort of make a broad generalization, but yeah, you can tell me if you're happy with that. But yes, again, exceptions in that. In Siswati, so this is an example in 47, it seems that in sort of speech, everyday speech or sort of fast speech, you can actually omit the auxiliary, but what that means is you end up with two subject markers in a row, essentially. Subject marker. So that's a sort of other variation. Again, I haven't seen that very broadly, but it's a little bit different. And again, I think that's what you have in the next example down. 5.2, what I've been calling auxiliary stacking, but I'm happy to hear other suggestions. where you have 2 auxiliaries in a row, and I'd also be happy to see 3, because I think it must be able to happen. So as long as you're happy with the ideas that might and repeat are auxiliaries in a language like Siswati, it seems that you have 2 auxiliary-like elements, so the boys might smoke again, basically. So might and repeat and then smoke. Similarly with the Songa examples, an auxiliary encoding the meaning of quickly and the meaning of again, drink. So you have 2 auxiliary forms, thank you. And we have some sort of little numbers in terms of distribution of that. Actually we have here, in our sample of 38 languages, 24 only allow 1 and 12 allow 2 or more. I think that's probably a bit of an over-representation. I think it's probably less that allow more to co-occur. It's quite limited distribution. No talk would be complete without a discussion of the verb auxiliary order. So again, in terms of talking about common kind of patterns or less common patterns in a restricted set of languages, and so far I think we're at 7. You can have main verb before the auxiliary, but that is the standard and only acceptable way of encoding certain tense aspect combinations. So this isn't necessarily like the advanced verb construction that we're hearing about or infinitival fronting. It doesn't seem to be at least synchronically associated with particular information structural readings. It's just now how you encode the future tense, for example. So those are examples from Rangi and Bugwe. And we have a small number of languages that do that. But again, how to sort of account for that, and that's probably a much more recent change, although I think advanced verb construction is reconstructed, and if you think that that may have its origins in that, then how far back does that go? So really what I sort of end with is more the same questions and sort of considerations. So if I take a very kind of broad definition of more than one element of a verbal nature which performs some kind of grammatical function, then I think it's very widespread. I think there's also good geographic distribution across the Bantu zones. So perhaps on that regard, good candidate for reconstruction as a thing that is present. I don't have specific support in favour of particular forms, although there are obviously like verbs and copulars that have been reconstructed, which we see time and time again in these auxiliary type constructions. This is sort of the point about, what patterns do you want to then follow, or do we need much more kind of localized regional sort of breakdown in terms of these patterns? If something's uncommon, do we kind of discard it? And because we see auxiliaries, the forms regularly involved in process of grammaticalization and becoming tense aspect markers and having their origins themselves in verbs, what kind of challenges does this sort of introduce? Because they're already sort of very ephemeral in nature. And then other kind of broader things which links to the sort of range of talks, in that obviously this doesn't at all happen in isolation, so it's linked to the broader systems of tense aspects, so certain things break down and other things then sort of develop to fill those roles and assume those sort of functions. So maybe here the sort of role of interlocking kind of factors is sort of not more important, but something that really to kind of be borne in mind. I think that's great.
You're right on time. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Yes. Yes. Michelle.
Thank you for an enlightening presentation. Just a comment on the study.
Oh yes, please.
Source, you mentioned that there are 3 categories of auxiliaries according to the verb that they introduce, either infinitive in the subjunctive form. I'm reading from the text.
Page 6.
Yes. Or both infinitive or subjunctive. But it gives out the main category, that is auxiliaries followed by what we call the situative or participial in the grammar. There are as many as the others, probably more.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
Second point, still about study. There are some nominal constructions which also function as auxiliary. like in Zulu again, kade, which means long before. It works as an auxiliary, the kade bila, or what's there before. There are one or two like this.
Maybe I can talk to you about the. Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't fall into your paper.
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. One comment and one, two things. I think the odd one out in your semantic listing is the adverbial.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, this doesn't make sense as opposed to temporal, aspectual, modal, and so on. I think something must be. Yeah. The other thing is the definition is of what to include and what not is a tough one. I think when I was describing Koti, I had this, and there were several ones, I can't remember them, which are normal main verbs, and they had funny constructions, and I couldn't guess what the meaning wasn't compositional. So they had unexpected, for me, unexpected meanings when used together with an infinitive or a second inflected. So you have two things there. If you have, of course, if you inflect twice for the same subject, that is a kind of auxiliary construction, I think. But then if you have infinitival constructions, the line is very hard to draw, and I think it is the only thing I could think of which would be at least useful for description is to put everything in that is not a composition, not a clear object of some other verb. Like if you have, he started to read the paper, he finished to read the paper, is that an auxiliary or not? Yeah, I mean, you could put it there, it's not very surprising, but if you have other meanings that are not, or if the morphology is the primary, you have two tenses following each other and they complement each other for one event, yeah, then thank you.
Great, thank you.
I think Yukiko had raised her hand for a question.
She says no.
No, but Jeffrey.
Right, and we also had someone. Would you?
Yes, thanks for a very interesting talk now. Is that a quick question? Thinking about the examples 30, 31, 32. I think it was an interesting way to analyze them as infinitives, but isn't it possible that these are rather like progressives or present tense markers? Of course they are to originate from the infinitive. That was just a question I popped up in my head.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I would have followed the glosses that were provided. I can't imagine that if that said some other tense aspect, so I'm like on 31 and 32, that I would have then said, oh, I'm coming and I'm reanalyzing that as an infinitive. But like
for example, for the two, what would mark the tense, if not the coup there? Because I guess the auxiliary is just a negative and a question marker and so on. So that's which can be very interesting then, because maybe then there's some contextual differences in the construction whether it's negative or not. Maybe the present tense is a zero marker and you would have coup in the negative and then you would find some kind of nice
absolutely.
definition or something of an older structure.
No, thank you. I definitely look at that. I mean, actually, just to draw on the ranking examples, there's even a variation if you have a coup and you don't have a coup. There's some kind of more certain, less certain, and these kind of things. So, I mean, maybe there's also something else to look at, but especially with the negation one there. 32. Thank you.
I think we had Tom and then Laura, but I don't know who wants to go first.
Okay. Yeah, so I have, one short question and maybe one speculative question that Tom could cut me off about. Right, but just a small point in 31, since you drew our attention to 31,
Yes.
I guess you know that coup is also the present progressive, so why do you think it's the infinitive there instead of the present progressive?
Yeah, so if that's the case, then that should probably be considered to be present progressive rather than infinitive mark, which I think follows on from Rasmus's question as well. So I may have made a mistake. What I was saying is that I think I would like to think that I didn't come along and now analyse that as an infinitive mark if there wasn't something there already, but if that's, I mean, you work on Yes. So
Yeah,
you can-
yeah,
so I did
yeah.
correct that. So that would then be removed from my ones that has, subject marker and infinitive, and that would no longer count in this category.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, then my more speculative question
Yeah.
that Tom might save us all from, is that yesterday, I don't work on tense aspects, so this is really a naive question, but I thought what I got out of the presentations yesterday, or especially John Waters, was that one important change in the history, well, going from Bantoid to Bantu, was the development of some tenses from an aspectual system. So do you think that auxiliaries, there could have already been auxiliary constructions that could have been recruited to create a more tense-like system, or do you, like I said, it's a speculative question. Are you willing to
So
speculate?
if I add a
about this?
speculative answer to your speculative question,
Yeah.
absolutely, in that this seems to be a good way of being able to do new things that you weren't able to do before. So if you're trying to form new constructions to encode new distinctions, it seems to me that auxiliaries are really good candidates. I definitely don't want to speculate on whether historic, like the discussion that was happening yesterday, which was these used to be only aspectual systems out of which other systems developed. But I think
Right, but this sort of strategy of
Yeah.
having auxiliaries and then they get grammaticalized, that could be something that goes way back.
And, I think so. I mean, maybe Dara has also had her hand up for a long time.
I have
I just had a.
Oh, that's
You're the one
like,
when you
we thought it was Yukiko's hand. Sorry.
I had a methodological question about how do you decide, if you just go based on sources, whether you consider something a separate word versus, like for example, this Herero thing, I would just consider that one word and an artifact of this unfortunate individual habit of writing things disjunctively.
And the one where, I think there was not the Herrera one, but one later on, again the Chichero example in 44, where, that's how they've written it, but you could definitely write it separately, and there may be other, stronger reasons to say, yes, that's, phonologically, that's...
And the inverse? Like the Swahili where the ku has dropped out, and what's left is just a stem and not a word.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider that to be a new tense marker then, or an auxiliary?
I think consider it to be an auxiliary.
Well,
Taka.
do you consider?
Taka.
But then there's no verb. Then there's no. What is that? Yeah.
So not the plane, not the chezo, is the
Nataka
auxiliary,
sema.
Nataka, yeah. So then the next stage would be Nataka,
Aliketafi.
which is what we see historically anyway. So the future tense marker came from Taka, so you're actually going through the same process again.
Yeah, and with other sort of aspectual verbs.
Like Mara.
Yeah,
Quish.
or yeah, to finish, to begin, all these regular verbs with aspectual meaning. Some people leave out sometimes the infinitival marker, which means it's no longer a known word, because they're not imperatives, certainly. So, but if it's only, then there are no auxiliaries anymore, if the whole thing is one word.
Yes. So if we're having this...
Well, it's just a definition. We all know what's going on, but if you have to have a principled database of something, then it becomes difficult.
We'll take one last question from
Yeah, you haven't said much about tone and the status of those finite verbs after an auxiliary, and actually I was actually missing that too a little bit on the relatives. We have talked little about subordination, of finite forms just by tone melodies. And I think it would be a very interesting thing to look here in your sample. I think the original stage was those finite forms after auxiliary were subordinate forms, participles, and I think they are also reconstructed by Muysen. And you do find languages in the Savannah zone where you think, okay, that's no longer active. But I think it's an important criterion to distinguish. Do you still have active subordination in the finite verb, like in Shona? So, and also there's a correlation with the subject prefix, so you need a pronominal prefix in the class 1 if it's have you lost that feature? So I think that would be an important thing to put into your typology, and I think then you would not come up with an analysis like in 30, 31, 32. This, I think actually that cannot happen, to have a subject model for these are grammaticalized tense aspect forms already, and then don't have anything to do with the infinitive complement of an auxiliary. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.